Thank you. I'm going to straight go to the panelists. These are incredible people. So I would say that, firstly, I'm not going to do introductions because I think we've got limited time. I'd encourage all the panelists to do a brief introduction if you feel necessary, but I think everyone's got names, everyone's got access to Google. Please look them up. They are incredible people. So I'm going to just preface it in that way. I'm going to slightly come in a slightly different order, if that's okay, to this, just because I think there might be a nice flow from that. Rupert, can I come to you first, just because I think you've been so...
Smith has to
Yeah, no, I know. Right, thank you. Yeah, I know. Yeah, Rupert, there's just... Yeah, can I come to you first, just because I think you've been so spearheading some of these debates for such a long time and been such a powerful activist in this space. And I just wondered, yeah, if I come to you first and then we'll go to Smith, if that's right.
Well, thanks so much, Indy, for that kind introduction. Yeah, so I now run a thing called the Climate Majority Project. The basic idea of the Climate Majority Project is there is already a majority of people who are deeply concerned about the kinds of things that Indy's been talking about. But that concern needs to be deepened further, among other things for the reasons that Indy gave. Most people still don't really understand just how bad the situation is. And people need to be helped to handle those difficult truths, because if you just dump them on people, then they just go into despair or cynicism or denial. And people need to be given meaningful, effective ways of acting together with other people, which do not depend on those who have chronically let us down so far, i.e. media, governments, most corporations, etc., but start to step into our own power together. And people need to be given the sense that all of this is already starting to happen and is already emerging, which it is, which is part of what we try to incubate in the Climate Majority Project and collaborate with the people who are doing this stuff already in businesses, in their communities, in churches, and more. And we think that when people are given all of those things, when they are enabled to have their sense of the truth of the situation deepened and helped to handle that truth and given meaningful off-ramps into collective action and helped to understand that this is already happening and that it's going to, for certain, to grow in the coming difficult years. Those are the four central strands of our theory of change. We believe that when all of that happens, then this climate majority can be truly activated and can step into its own power, and that is about the one hope that still exists, that we can avoid civilizational collapse, because that is what we are otherwise very definitely headed for. There is no chance that a radical flank alone, or the activists alone, or technologists alone, etc., can see us through this. It's going to take most people actually being actively on board. And if that sounds unprecedentedly ambitious, it kind of is. It's a bit like a wartime mobilization, although as Indy said very clearly, our situation is actually worse than the situation that people faced during the Second World War. But it could happen, or at least we don't know that it couldn't happen. Coming back to where Indy started, the way that I have expressed that in my work is by saying that this civilization is finished, as in my little book called This Civilization is Finished. I'll pass around a copy. And just to explain carefully what I mean by that, I mean it quite literally. This civilization is finished. We cannot go on like this. I'm not saying we are bound to collapse. I am saying that the only way now that we may be able to avoid a kind of set of termination events is by transforming everything in some of the ways that Indy was talking about in his talk. So in no meaningful sense will what comes out the other side be this civilization that we currently have. So this civilization is finished. It will be transformed. It will, for example, be radically relocalized over time, either by way of a more or less deliberate choice or by way of a collapse. Or by some combination of the two. And those are the three scenarios that I explore in that book and in a lot of my other work. On hearing Indy's talk, you might be thinking, oh, Christ, it really looks like collapse, doesn't it? I mean, it seems as if we're super fucked. And I think that's exactly right. But again, I want to put that very precisely. It seems as if we're super fucked. That's not the same thing as saying we are for certain super fucked. And as long as you don't know for certain that you're super fucked, it's worth trying not to be super fucked, yeah? And this is the idea behind my participation in this book, which some of you may also be aware of, Deep Adaptation, which I edited with Jem Bendell, who'll be known to some of you. I'll pass that one around as well for people's interest. So Jem Bendell, as you may or may not be aware, believes that we definitely are super fucked, and that therefore we have to engage in what he's termed deep adaptation, which means preparing our society for collapse. And my argument is that we don't know for sure that we are. We're headed that way, but we don't know for sure that we are. But that given that we're headed that way, we'd better be prepared for it as part of what we do, right? So everything one does, one has to have, as it were, a side order of deep adaptation in it. It's reckless at this point not to, among other things, prepare for at least potential, probably likely, civilizational collapse. But what I also argue is that we ought to aim still for preventing that. We ought to aim for what I call transformative adaptation. We ought to aim for ending this civilization by way of deliberate, voluntary transformation, rather than undeliberate, involuntary collapse. How do I take us from that into retrofit? Well, it's quite simple, really. What the Ukraine crisis has, I think, started to show to a hell of a lot of people is that really most of the crises that we face that are heading us at the moment towards collapse are thoroughly intertwined. This is what is sometimes meant by the use of the term polycrisis, but I think that term isn't the best term because it makes it kind of sound like you've just got a whole lot of crises and maybe it just happens that they coincide. What I think people are realizing through the Ukraine crisis, and we can help that realization, is that the Ukraine crisis and the energy crisis and the climate crisis and the inequality crisis, these are all basically the same thing, right? And part of the way in which we get to tackle them all simultaneously is by taking something like deep retrofit deeply seriously, to start to remove the power of the oligarchs, to no longer place all of our trust in governments to sort this, because they're plainly not going to do so, to remove the insane situation where at the moment we're doing a hell of a lot of heating the sky, where a third of houses in this country have no loft insulation. A third. I mean, people cannot believe the statistic. It's because most of those properties are rental properties, and there's basically no incentive on the landlord to put insulation in, and the residents will soon be gone, right? So in the Climate Majority Project, we cooperate with wonderful organizations like Retrofit Balsall Heath, who are represented in the exhibition upstairs and who you saw briefly in the film and in one of Indy's slides earlier. And what they are seeking to do is to model, obviously they can't do it at full scale yet, is to model the kind of transformation that is going to be necessary, which is incredibly difficult, and we don't even know how to do all of it yet. And even if we do all of it, as Indy said, we're still headed on the path to collapse unless some other things get able to be transformed a little bit further down the track. But we don't know that that can't happen. So it's worth trying to transform our society and ultimately transform our civilization through initiatives like Retrofit Balsall Heath and many others, even though they're only part of the picture, even though we don't know that they'll get us out of this, because what they will certainly do is tackle those simultaneous crises and is show a model for the kind of thing that needs to happen. And it will start to happen a lot more in the next few years. The government that we have in this country will soon be gone. Within 18 months, we'll have a government which will almost certainly be headed either with or without a full majority by Labour, and things will start to improve. Will things improve enough? No, absolutely nowhere near enough. All of these things are basically certain. So the importance of these kind of community-led initiatives is to do what we can now, because we can wait, is to show and to model what needs to happen so that we influence governments as they start to emerge and influence also regional and local governments who will almost certainly become more powerful and important in the years to come, partly because our society has gradually realized that we're ridiculously over-centralized, but partly because as things start to break down, things will start to become more relocalized. Some of you might be thinking, yeah, but isn't there a wonderful way which we might sort of luck out of this a bit? As global climate change kicks in more, the temperature's going to be going up in this country. Maybe we're not going to need quite so much insulation in years to come. Probably most of you in this room are far too intelligent to think that. But if you are thinking that, let me just say two brief things against it. Firstly, as many of you will be well aware, insulation is important in summer as well as in winter. But secondly, and much more interestingly, as Indy said in his important talk, we do not know the way that climate change, which is actually accurately called climate breakdown, is going to play out. In particular, we do not know that this country is going to get warmer over the next 20 years. Now, that might be surprising to some of you, but one of the biggest threats, just to underscore the sense in which we need to deepen people's understanding of the truth, one of the biggest threats we're now starting to become aware of is that the currents in the North Atlantic are being radically disrupted by all the melting ice in the Arctic. It is quite possible that the AMOC current system, part of which is the Gulf Stream in the North Atlantic, may be seriously disrupted in the next 20 years. It is entirely possible that our climate by 2040 will be cooling significantly rather than warming. And when I say significantly, I mean we could be headed towards a semi-Siberian climate, and it would also incidentally be a much drier climate. The future is very likely to be drier. And that's another thing we have to be prepared for. But what I'm getting at is that one of the key aspects of the way we have to prepare and the way we have to transform is by being open to the possibility that the future will be different to even the current trends that we think can be extrapolated, like a heating world. Yes, the world is going to carry on heating for a long time to come, whatever we do, but it may be that this part of the world starts cooling. Okay, that's really all I wanted to say. I think I've had about my 10 minutes. I'll just leave you with the thought once again that if this is vibing with you, then, well, it's almost certain that you're all part of the climate majority already in some sense. But if, in particular, you want to do something about it beyond what you're already doing, do consider reaching out to me, reaching out to us. Look at the website, climatemajorityproject.com. Look at our partners. Consider whether you want to put yourselves forward for being one of those partners or collaborators. And I'm very delighted to be at this event where it seems like we're having a really open and honest conversation about these crucial matters. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rupert. I'm super delighted. Thank you for that contribution, and thank you for all the work that you do. Smith, I cannot speak more highly of the work that you've done and the journey you've been on, from being an architect to an engineer to leading Bureau Happel's sustainability department and now sort of CEOing the Green Building Council and the work that you're doing. I would love to hand over to you. And what are you thinking? What's your thoughts and how we should be responding to all this?
Thanks, Indy. You'll be pleased to know I wrote Civilization down here as well. And I'm hearing that this civilization is super fucked. But I'm cool with that because I think this civilization is super fucked up. So I'd quite like a new one, actually. Let's have it. I think it can be a lot better. And I think there's something hopeful in that as well. Like, I don't want to carry on like this. I think that we could live in a much more beautiful, loving way, and I'm using the word love more. I've been reading a lot about prehistory recently, and it's all the different kind of civilizations and ways in which we've lived throughout human history, and it's actually making me feel a lot of hope that we're so creative. There's so many different ways that we have lived and can live, and in the grand scheme of things, there's a lot of hope there.
You've been reading
for me,
maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I was roped into this yesterday, because I work upstairs, and they said, oh, just come downstairs, it'll be fine. And I wasn't sure what I was going to talk about, but since I took up this post as Chief Exec of UK Green Building Council, and maybe some of my colleagues are in the room, I've been doing a little thing where every Monday morning I write what has been termed a Monday musing, where I basically just write a little bit about something I've been reading at the weekend. I'm in 4 book groups and I have a bit of a problem. I also collect empty boxes. Don't know why. I think it's a prepper thing. So as I was listening, I wanted to just read out like one of the little Monday musings that I've written recently. I wrote this just like for my team. I haven't done anything with it for you all. This is very like raw, but it's something that's been on my mind a lot, I guess. And the reason that this one came up is because we had an all-team meeting where we had climate psychologist Rebecca Nesta come in and talk to us about, you know, the psychology of all of this. Like, we've heard a lot about, you know, how we're seemingly, possibly super fucked. And also, I just really love that I get to grow up and just, like, swear all the time and get paid for it. It's really fucking great. But you know, I think that's also maybe a little bit therapeutic, right? Like, we need to swear and we need to use proportionate language because we know how like fucking awful it is and terrifying and so on. And so I'm worried about our collective psychology in all of this. And so I wanted to dig into that a little bit more. And so Rebecca Nesta came and she spoke to us all. And one of the things that she talked about was intergenerational trauma and its impact on our ability to tackle the climate crisis. And I was like, ooh. Okay, need to know more about that. And I asked her, like, what can I read? Because, yeah, that's always my question. And she recommended me this essay by Steffi Bednarek. And I read it, and it was amazing. And then in the Monday after that, I wrote this to my team. So, yeah, blah, 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 inspired by it. Our workshop. Yes, recommended this essay, and wow. So, quote, efforts to meet the challenges of climate change need to go beyond a mere reduction in CO2 emissions. They require the maturing of the collective culture into a much larger capacity to process painful experiences whilst holding the interconnected, non-linear complexity of life. That's Steffi Bednarek. And now this is me. I imagine many of us can relate to feeling at a loss that no matter how much information we have about climate change and ecosystem breakdown, humanity fails to take proportionate action. What Bednarek is saying in this essay is that it's no surprise, given what humanity has collectively been through, and to tackle the environmental crises, we need to collectively heal from our collective trauma. Oof. She describes trauma response as, quote, an adaptation to overwhelming experiences without recourse to sufficient support, without which traumatic experiences can't be assimilated and are split off in an attempt to numb the wounded part and protect survival. This can appear in the form of deflection, denial, rationalization, fragmentation, dissociation, or numbing. Sound familiar? In times of overwhelm, the brain's structure facilitates disconnection, allowing the left brain that perceives things as fixed and known to take over control and perform the tasks of daily life, whilst much of the living system's function of the right hemisphere is suppressed, remaining in survival mode. Now, I just pause a minute. I think that maybe some of the neuroscience has moved on and the left brain, right brain stuff shouldn't be taken too literally, but I think the point really, really stands. But what's Bednarek is emphasizing is that this isn't about individual trauma, where one person might be acting from a survival mode place, but about the way we're collectively actively acting from this place. And there's this really great description of a society dominated by left-brain thinking in the essay that's really, really scarily familiar. So she speaks of the original trauma of being disconnected from the rest of nature, layered with colonialism, world wars, nuclear proliferation, systemic impoverishment of huge swathes of society, and the way in which external and environmental factors are passed down the generations through genomes, such that we are all born into a trauma field or traumascape. So it's no surprise that our collectively traumatized humanity is struggling to deal with this huge existential threat. We are in the grips of a collective fight, flight, freeze response. The flight response is linked to anxiety, panic, and hypervigilance. The freeze response shows up in numbing and dissociation, and the fight response can lead to increased aggression, violence, and reactivity. Again, like, it all sounds super familiar, right? On a collective level, different pockets of society will have different coping strategies depending on their resilience and support levels, but a chronically traumatized community is more likely to be reactive rather than responsive. So, again, it sounds like seemingly super fucked. But I found a lot of hope in this because it seems clear to me that just telling people how bad things are isn't working. And so I'm heartened that there's a reason for this and that there's an alternative approach at hand. So Bednarek says, it's not cognition, but relationship, community, and a reconnection with safe belonging that brings healing. I therefore suggest that collective forms of trauma-informed support are needed in order to increase psychological resilience in the population. So this means supporting each other to turn towards and process our collective painful experiences. Importantly, to move past these trauma responses, we need to validate them, thank them for how they've helped us survive in the absence of adequate support, and in this way we can metabolize them and then heal each other and our ecosystems. So I think this is what we're looking at now. We're looking to work together to heal our collective intergenerational trauma. I think shouting at each other and screaming that it's all super fucked is a part of this. And like, please do scream into your pillows at night and collect empty boxes if that makes you feel better. But I don't know why I'm sharing that. But I think that the action that we have to take here, and we've seen it, and what Patrick said and what Indy said, is like, we need to work together really, really differently. And I know that we can, and the Davids have told us that we can. There are so many different ways in which we've worked. There are so many different ways in which we've created festivals like today that are helping us build this. And I really recommend being in loads of book groups and having loads of conversations with loads of different people, and like breaking out of different silos and different places, and that then, like, through those conversations, we are already doing that collective healing and building that capacity for us to be able to achieve this change, and so that we can move into a civilization that is not fucked up. And now I have to go.
Thank you so much.
Really
Thank you so
sorry.
much for that. And I think Smith, thank you for that contribution, because I think for me, that's what makes Retrofit Reimagined fundamentally different, right? We're not here talking about sort of air source heat pumps and a solar panel solving the world. Actually, what we're building is community and conversations, and I think Imi and many other people in the team have been building the conviviality that's at the center of dealing with that. And I thank you so much for contributing. And we're sorry to see you go. Thank you. Farzana, maybe I can use that as a nice segue to come to you, because Farzana, your work in Healing Justice London has been both extraordinary in terms of its humility, but it's also carefulness. And I think carefulness in terms of language, position, but also understanding this transition in a much, I would say, in that trauma-informed way, but also in a kind of healing-informed way, but also recognizing, I think one of the things that's really important for us to recognize is that many societies and many people, even in this country and around the world, have been living in this trauma for many, many years. Now there is perhaps a new addition, right, that are going to be living in that sort of trauma. So, Farzana, maybe I'd love you to open up and sort of share your perspectives on this and all the great work that you're doing. Thank you.
Can I give you my water? And maybe remind everyone, this is a lot. Like, it's not existential, it's visceral. It's in our bodies, so maybe if you've got a drink or something, just take a minute to like replenish your life force. You're also made of water, so yeah, pour in. Thank you, Smith, Imi, Indy, Sarah, because all of you have already touched on what I wanted to touch on, really, which is this deep invitation to be right-sized. We are here in the consequences and the wake of being out of proportional size with planet, with each other, with the more than human. And so really everything that I'm going to speak to is about this, how do we practice moving into becoming right-sized? And that really brings us back to this point, Indy, you made of human. And as humans, anything that we make is fundamentally going to have the contradictions, the complexities, the entanglements, because we are all of those things. Like, beautifully, stunningly imperfect. And there's something really wonderful about coming into that space and practicing together how we use that humanity, that humanizing to move forward. Just to give you a little context about myself and maybe why I'm sharing and speaking, I'm one of the co-founders and co-directors at Healing Justice London. We work to build community-led health and healing, particularly for marginalized communities who disproportionately are impacted by climate breakdown, all forms of marginalization, organized abandonment by state infrastructure. And we have 3 kind of key strategies or sites of intervention and reimagining. Building internal capacity within our communities and ourselves. What are the skills and bandwidths that we need to be able to access the healing and transform our societies? Structural capacity, what is the material infrastructure that we need in order for us to be able to organize and build and thrive and experience flourishing together? And then sustained capacity. We have genius and wisdom, especially those of us who have survived violence and marginalization, because we've already had to practice the act of creativity and survival all the time. And so from that space, how do we sustain our most radical ideas, which are more prone as a result of trauma, oppression, austerity, to break down, to conflict, to becoming fragile? So you'll hear our phrase at Healing Justice London is we create capacity for transformation. A lot of the times we're saying, okay, marginalized communities, people with lived experience, go ahead and self-determine, be sovereign, have the answers to the solutions, but we're the most capacity depleted, energy depleted, resource depleted. And so our solutions may be there, our strategies might be there, but they are set up to fail. And so really thinking about how do we put in the right resources for those ideas and solutions to be sustained and to flourish and to be able to exist out loud in the world. I wanted to begin, actually, I am that guy, with a poem by June Jordan, and I always share this because I think it really speaks to what we call life-affirming infrastructure. Given that the world is designed against life with capitalism, how do we build infrastructures that are life-affirming and honoring the work of Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who speaks to that. June Jordan, she says, what does it mean to design tables and chairs when we still have knives and forks? What does it mean to design cities so dancing all together will not appear ridiculous or even worse, a special televised event? These designs of revolution require a turning away from the enemy. They require going up the hill, as did Castro, or tuning in to a truly different frequency, as did Elijah, for an actually different world. And this kind of invitation of both what is the level of critical destruction to the world as it is that is needed, but also creation and connecting to the right relationship, tuning into the frequency of the world that we need to be in order to move. And so at the heart of everything I'm going to be touching on is, what do we know about how we know that as human beings, when we come together, we have the trauma, as Smith pointed to, the ongoing cumulative chronic stress that we're all under, and the kind of the nature in which we act out with one another. How can we sustain the infrastructures, the retrofitting that we want to do when under pressure, the things that we do is turning on one another? Under pressure, we are punitive. Under pressure, there is power imbalances, which mean there isn't a fair distribution of resources. So how can we practice new ways together? And how, under pressure, in the times that we're living in, might we have the capacity to not be punitive, to not withdraw resources? And where will that capacity come from? And how will that be generated amongst ourselves? And there are different ways that I want to invite into the space. Indy, you already touched on the embodied. Part of the disconnection that we feel is the brutalization as a result of capitalism, which relies on the brutalization of our body, and colonization, the dismemberment, the I think, therefore I am, you're just a mind, and that's where your value is, in the totalizing of rationalization, as opposed to a full being that is in contact and in relationship with its aliveness, with its wholeness. How do we reconnect with this embodied capacity, the soma, which is not just the body, but the mind, soul, land, spirit, all of those things, and it's a living organism that is moving and changing and evolving all the time. And so a key invitation that I want to bring as part of our strategies is we need to be doing this work of embodied transformation. We need to be growing the capacity in ourselves to navigate complexity. How many of us can do that? That's not what we practice. Hold contradictions. We're human beings that I think Annette from Dark Matter Labs once shared this with me. In our current context, every decision we make has a shadow and a light. Those are the options. So how do we hold contradictions and still be human with one another? How do we hold and grow the capacity for the level of precarity and unpredictability that we're navigating and actually already being survived by those that are in the global south, working class, frontline communities? How can that be grown? And that can really be grown in an embodied level within our bodies. A lot of the times when we say capacity, we'll hear this very neoliberalized self-care, like my boundary is no. The beautiful thing about capacity is it can diminish when there's not enough resource, but it can be grown when it is resourced. And so there's an invitation about how do we move resources to the right spaces so capacity can be grown, and we don't move into this neoliberal individualized sense of self-care or, but actually know how to have more bandwidth for complexity, uncertainty, unpredictability, and contradiction. The other thing that I want to, how am I doing for time? Because I'm like 2 minutes? Okay, cool. I want to touch on is the work around grief work. Grief work's been a fundamental part of our work at Healing Justice London. One of the reasons that we work with loss, we know that the world as it is needs to end, but also to know completion. To know, if you want to exit a capitalist society, how do you know when you're full? How do you know when you're nourished? How do you know when it's enough? We live in, and we've been trained and socialized in societies where it's infinite, this premise of infinite accumulation, infinite greed, that there is all of this resource that won't be exhausted. But how do we have a felt sense that I am full? How do we have a felt sense that this is enough? And how can that be known within ourselves and then met when other people don't have enough and we can extend into that space or share from when we have enough and we don't need more? So grief work, not only as a way to process the loss and the pain of all the different changes that we're going to be going through in the transformation, but also as a way to be skillful around the types of changes that we're going to be experiencing and to practice a different relational politics to land, to ourselves, to one another. And I was going to say trauma work, but I feel like Smith spoke to that. So maybe I'll pause here but and kind of really conclude on the point that while we are in these multiple crises, I feel the invitation to rehumanizing, to coming into right size is absolutely one of the most beautiful things that we get to offer one another. We're not walking on earth as gods, but we're treading lightly as stewards, as guests, as travelers. And that's a really wonderful thing to be able to offer one another, to offer each other the spaciousness of being human, the spaciousness of I'm a traveler, I'm a guest, and this invitation to be able to witness one another in that way. For me, that's a really stunning space to be encountering this life and this planet.
Thank you, Farzana. I think it's so important to hear those words, and also because I think one of the things, yes, we are quote unquote fucked. However, I actually also would like to quote Jurassic Park in this moment in time to say, life wants to live. Life wants to live. However, this time, life wants to live because actually we're going to be living in a fork between mutually assured destruction or mutually assured thriving. And that's why, Farzana, I think for me, what you're saying is so important. We're going to have to find a way to support mutually assured thriving for everyone. There is no pathway I see, either in nuclear and into all the kind of soldiers wargaming the future, that a few survive and many don't. That means we have to change our perspective of how we drive that into a genuinely a mutual pathway of thriving. And that requires us to do the human embodied work in a fundamentally different sense of that. So thank you. Thank you. Neal, can I come to you next? That'd be okay. Neal is an extraordinary educator. Neal, you've been building, you're building the London School of Architecture. It's built on great legacy, but also you're building the framework for like the next layers of thinkers, of people who synthesize the future and think about that. Can I come to you to say, how does this reflect back to you in terms of this conversation?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. This is a very beautiful discussion, and I feel very much intellectually at home this morning and this afternoon. So thanks to all those involved in organising it. So as Indy says, I run something called I run something called the London School of Architecture, which is an amazing community of practitioners and students and learners, collaborators. It's about 10 years old, so still new, still learning and still forming, and I've been leading it for the last 2 years. I'm a historian, not an architect. A historian of architecture and design and the built environment. So I always come at these questions and at these discussions partly from my with my kind of pragmatic hat on, leading an institution, and then I think the more interesting part of my brain, which is thinking about history, and thinking, I suppose, therefore, about longer trajectories and longer histories and wider context to some of the discussions that we're having, and indeed to some of Indy's provocations and terrifying factorials. One thing that I always think about in these discussions is I suppose it's a little novella. It's a little story, a short story that was published first in serial form and then altogether in 1892 by William Morris, who, as hopefully you all know, is kind of known as the progenitor of the arts and crafts movement. And who was a radical, who was a romantic socialist, I think also a proto-ecologist, anti-statist. I think someone who presciently speaks to a number of themes which seem to be underpinning this festival. And in this little book called News from Nowhere, with the subtitle Or an Epoch of Rest, which I always think is such kind of sumptuous subtitle, and definitely kind of resonates with me. I would love an epoch of rest. He describes he's returning from a meeting of the Socialist League in Belsize Park and takes the tube to Hammersmith. And he gets back to his house in Hammersmith and long story short, falls asleep. And wakes up in, I think it's 2102. Someone might remember this better. And he finds that the future, some distance in the future, looks remarkably like some distance in the past, in which social relations are very, very different. There are different conceptions of value. News from Nowhere always seems to me a kind of radical parable of degrowth. And I mention this, I suppose, for a couple of reasons. First of all, that Morris, writing in the late 19th century, is, of course, also observing a period of crisis, a series of intersecting crises, felt as acutely, perhaps, as we're feeling ours, even if we now know the magnitude of our challenges are so much larger. Again, as Indy, I think, set up really nicely. Trying to contend with, trying to understand, trying to respond to these kind of rabid and rapid forms of industrialization, and imagining the kind of societal collapse, civilizational collapse, which Smith and Rupert referred to, and which I also, would warmly welcome on some level. And is trying to imagine, therefore, what the future might look like. And it just so happens that the future looks incredibly much like the past. And as he journeys through a very changed London, which has decentralized, which I think you could interpret as biodiverse. He passes one building, which is the Palace of Westminster, which has become a literal shit heap, which is a kind of anti-statist metaphor that change is not necessarily going to happen through the instruments of the nation state, and certainly in Morris's case, the imperial nation state. And he arrives to meet this very old man who remembers what's happened over the preceding 120 years, who's occupying spaces within the British Museum. And the British Museum has also become this kind of ruin, which is a comment on the kind of collapse of the premises and precepts of knowledge sort of born of the Enlightenment. And this is kind of quite an eccentric little book, but I think contains many lessons for us today, number one, but also because it was part of this burgeoning sensibility, intellectual movement, but also practical movement of the arts and crafts, which again I think has resonance with what we're discussing today. It spawned, for example, this kind of revival in the ideal of the simple life, and you get people like the architect and designer C.R. Ashby moving his nascent guild of handicraft from Essex House in the East End of London to Chipping Campden, and trying to imagine what these kind of new social and economic relations between people might look like. It spawns, or is manifested, I should say, in the Garden City movement. And it's also manifested in debates about education, about technical, artisanal and professional education, in particular through people like William Richard Letherby, one of the founders of the Central School of the Arts and Crafts and something called the Brixton School of Building, which we now know as CSM and the South Bank University, but which had really radical origins. And I also think that Morris is a kind of proto-decolonial thinker, and as well as an eco-socialist, and I'll come back to that. I suppose what I really wanted to reflect on is the limitations, I suppose, from my point of view, of an architecture school. Our understanding within the space of the architecture school, and I'm generalizing, is limited in terms of understanding industrial organization, industrial capacity, and I think therefore there's a kind of lack of imagination about labor relations, let alone wider socio-economic relations. And I think that we need to kind of get a grip on that if we're going to seek to meet in our small way as educators some of those macro challenges to which people have already referred. I'm also very interested in what I might call the kind of epistemic limitations of existing disciplines and practices. So because I run an architecture school, but I'm not an architect, I consider myself only to have drunk half the Kool-Aid of architecture. And what I mean by that is I am concerned with and about the limitations of certain largely 19th century forms of professionalism, namely architecture, engineering, planning, which came a little bit later. And the fact that a lot of these disciplines, a lot of these ways of knowing and their associated ways of being are bound up in fundamentally colonial attitudes, extractivist attitudes. That doesn't mean that they're entirely irredeemable. It doesn't mean that there's nothing useful in them as disciplines or forms of practice. But it does make me question whether there is radical potential necessarily in their conventions. And so I'm quite interested in what we can do to catalyse change and maybe move beyond those existing disciplines. Anyway, so I've kind of gone from this slightly highfalutin thing about Morris. I'm trying to kind of land in something more rooted and more pragmatic. One of the things that we're thinking very intensely about is pre-university or extra-university education under the title of something that I've been calling Part Zero. And that means a series of outreach programs, and you might expect me to be doing that and to talk about that. They're aimed at young people from underserved and underrepresented communities. But the thing which I think has real potential is a bit of research work that we want to do over the next year, and it would be wonderful to collaborate with some of the people on the program and here on this panel, in which we want to understand not only what are the kind of desirable career routes, but I suppose lifestyles, for want of a better expression. I think perhaps drawing on some of what Farzana was talking about, how we want to live and relate to each other, how you might like to learn, to understand what the industrial and economic need is. As I say, we don't really understand, or we understand in very loose terms, what the kind of existing industrial capacity is, what are the new roles and responsibilities and modes of work going to be, and can we start to ensure that there's a pipeline, for want of a better expression, of amazing, energized, diverse young people engaged in that, and then how can we leverage some of the tools of the neoliberal state, and in particular the planning system, to provide a kind of resource underpinning to allow us to scale and indeed to sustain those programs. And I think that that's a really important bit of work for us to do. It's not about getting lots of young people into architecture. It's about thinking about the intersection of the natural and built environment and all the different roles and responsibilities we're going to need when we undergo this quite profound economic and socioeconomic and sociocultural change. The final thing I did want to say is it's wonderful for me in my position to see some alumni in the audience and some new colleagues on faculty here, but also some of our current students who are not in the room at the moment. I think they're upstairs on our Part 2 architecture programme, who have come up with this, I think, amazing idea with the Building Centre about what they call the Healthy Homes Hub, and how we might start to give greater high street presence, I suppose, to some of the ideas and discussions we're having. I think the Building Centre, 90 years old last year, has to reinvent itself to address some of these challenges, and to do so with much greater alacrity than perhaps it is at the moment. And I think there's some amazing ideas our students have come up with, so do please talk to them in the little exhibition site on the ground floor. I've probably run over time, so I'll shut up, but very good to see you all. Thank you, Indy.
Thank you, Neal, and thank you for taking us back into history and bringing this back a reflective view. As Pauline said, it's an age of kind of philosophers and makers, and being able to do those two things together, I think, is really critical. I'm going to hand over to Jen, but I'm also going to invite the panel to change our seats in this process. If I can, if we could just, that would be great. I would.
I appreciate. I was making it look really weird, but I had a baby 9 months ago, and my postnatal body was just not comfortable at all on the high chair.
We'll follow your lead. So, Jen, it's delighted that you're here, and I think for many of the people in the audience, one thing I would say is Jen is an extraordinary partner in not only Retrofit, Reimagined, but also many other things. And I think what makes Jen and her team extraordinary is not only the care, but also the robustness of that care. And that robustness of care is, I think, an exemplary type of relationship, to not only have the supportive, generative support, but actually be able to have the robustness to be able to actually challenge in a comfortable way. And there's been an extraordinary leader in that space, in my view, in terms of being able to drive the conversation forward with vast generosity, but also vast integrity. So, Jen, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you, Indy, and let me also reciprocate and thank you and Imi and the Civic Square and DM teams for your generous, incredible leadership. I'm Jen, so I'm CEO of 30 Percy, and thank you for what you've just told me, but it made me realise I like my organisation a lot, but I work in a sector which is in philanthropy, where I've actually drunk, I think, 0 of the Kool-Aid. Or maybe a tiny bit, I don't know. I wasn't exactly sure where to take this. I'll go with it. I think it's... I'm actually quite sweary, but I'm not... there's something about my conditioning that means that I can't be sweary right now, but we'll see. I'm going to take it... I think it's a description, but from a slightly different position of the system. I've taken out any of my statistics that were depressing, because I think that was covered earlier. And I'll try and be true also to this sense of standing on others' learnings and credit as much as possible where things that I say come from, so people can actually hear in some cases from them later, which is really great. So on Retrofit, and although I've got this like hefty notebook, I am definitely not a designy person. I am a lawyer and a tax lawyer by training, so there's only words written in here, and sometimes numbers. To use DM language, Retrofit is a real entanglement. It's where people working on climate breakdown, there's this collision between, are we solving a technical problem or are we talking about whole systems, transformation, upheaval, and it really, for me, comes together in Retrofit. It's at the forefront of this new materials economy, and I was reading yesterday about mycelium and their ability to be insulation. That's as technical retrofitty as I'm going to get, but it just sounded incredible, and if there's some on display here, I'd love to meet it. I think it's also naughty because it speaks to our relationship with our home, and as someone who's been watching far too much BBC couples therapy, that definitely has things to do with our childhood and our childhood experience, as well as intergenerational trauma and conditioning. It's also the place where land and economic justice is so present in everybody's lives. And I think Alistair Parvin's talking later about that. But I think that for people in my position, I'm not my imagination is rubbish, so I actually see it. I find it easier to see the kind of more dystopian view, which is about a flow of capital, effectively from government through procurement, that just goes straight through our existing systems and out into our privatized ownership infrastructure. Like, for me, that feels very real. I think Alistair talked about it in the context of COVID, and when government put money in, a lot of it went to private landlords, and I think with Retrofit something similar is very foreseeable, at least for me. But I also am so grateful for the visionaries in the room and the people who can rethink this deeply and hopefully fairly quickly, who hold visions of commoning, who are getting us to really question what should be subject to a market exchange, and what shouldn't. And again, looking for this talk, I saw that there's a seaweed commons, and that gave me quite a lot of hope and optimism, although I don't know if seaweed is a good material or not, so someone will come and tell me that later. I've got a lot to learn. Then I wanted to talk a bit about the community and why this scale of the neighbourhood, which has come up, has been so important. And I think it's where you've got this level of complexity. It needs to be rooted. And it seems to me like the most holistic and thoughtful visions are often coming from the people in our communities who are most rooted in local knowledge, most rooted in accountability. So there's a sort of integrity, I think, that comes from taking a very in finance and things, people are obsessed with scale, but this hyper-local scale just feels so precious. From an economic justice point of view as well, given the complexity of our financial web, the street in particular, when you think about it, it makes it more possible to analyse like where capital flows are going already, like who owns their house, who rents, there's so much entanglement there that you start to see when you work at street level, that it just feels quite helpful. And then the other thing is that I shy away a lot from top-down frameworks and modelling, because, as soon as if you're working, and I've learned this from Mimi's told me this in no uncertain terms, that when funders or others try and impose these top-down frameworks on organisations working to build trust in communities, that they can very quickly pollute trust-building conversations, because people that work in teams, and maybe actually someone in Civic Square said this to me, like already that relationship that you're building with your neighbour becomes about data that you might need to get from them so that you know whether or not a particular financing model will work, and that polluting is very real. And then on capital, and I think philanthropy obviously has a historic context here. I personally work for a foundation that is funded through the marketisation and privatisation of security, and also the exit of a cleaning products business that would have been incredible if it could have been held and owned in a commons. So we are working to change the systems the economic systems that philanthropy has been born from. And when we're doing that, we're in between worlds. And I wanted to bring that because on the one hand, we can see the world of like abundant leadership and yet scarcity of resources, where, you know, organizations are having to scrap, to also being very proximate to the world of private wealth and private capital at the minute, which has an abundance of resources, but not enough leadership, and where it's almost extremely the opposite. It's almost like, particularly in venture spaces, there's almost too much capital for investable companies, effectively, that are coming through, it's incredibly frustrating. And the other perspective on that as well is that within these private wealth systems that close up, I guess we see very clearly, they feel very locked. This is the most depressing bit, I think. They feel very locked into a specific way of thinking, which, you know, is based on capital growth rather than capital resilience, let alone community resilience, let alone the donut. It feels very far removed. And also, someone referred to it the other day as the house of finance, which I thought was a good pun. But actually, the layers of governance that sit, and I really worry when I see things that say, oh, this will be public money and then this will be private capital. Like, you see it so much. Let me just demystify. Private capital is layers and layers and layers of boards that become increasingly detached, like the further up you go. And sometimes it needs to even be said out loud, like the board of a trust company delegates to a family office, which has a board, which has an investment committee, which delegates to several probably asset investment advisors that have boards, that have investment committees, that invest in funds that have boards, investment committees that themselves will often then invest in funds which have boards, investment committees, which will then invest perhaps in a business or maybe something that's like synthetic and not even businessy. And that, for me, that house of capital, and those layers are held in place by governance systems where people who are often fair-minded but showing up in these systems and performing, you know, there's so much unlearning and work that needs to happen there. That was the most depressing bit. And then I guess as a philanthropy, and I won't spend too long on this because we don't necessarily feel we sit with a lot of the answers, but it's in some ways we're operating in two sites, working a little bit with our methodologies, but in a fairly light touch way, so we're not imposing too much, is to unlock capital and get it out to people who are leading in this moment, and then also do a bit of work up in that site of private wealth to try and introduce new investment logics that are based on some of the things that Farzana was talking about, and the donut as well. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to come to the audience for a couple of questions. One thing I was going to say, Jen, was that even allowing ourselves to use the words of public and private gives permission to the illusion that there is somehow private wealth when we know it's increasingly entangled.
Yes.
We're locked into these paradigms that reinforce these illusions, which benefits a few, right? Just because it's kind of extraordinary, these languages that are embedded into us and we replicate out. So yeah, thank you, Jen, very much for that. So I'm going to come quickly. Are there a couple of hands? Come on, this has not been much.
It's been quite a long stint, I think.
Yeah. One, I'm going to walk around. Second, right, two corners. I'm going to take both questions quickly, and then we're going to, because it's been a long stint.
I don't have a question. I just want to say huge thanks. And I've been sitting here on the border of tears, just really grateful for feeling slightly less alone. So yesterday I went to the AJ Retrofit conference, which was actually deeply uplifting, but sitting very much within that canon that you've all been critiquing. And yeah, I just feel like the need to take a moment to say thank you.
Hey, how are you doing? Good to see you, my friend. Lovely to see you.
Hi, thank you. Sorry, I'm just wondering why you use the word fucked a lot and extremely fucked and stuff like that. I'm just wondering, have you been following Kin Anami on Instagram or anything like that? Because it's unusual to use that. But my actual contribution is around the spiritual side of things and the aspect of that and people like Amilcar Cabral and their importance around revolution and decolonising processes.
I'm one of the guilty with the swearing. I'm kind of with Smith on this. I think one of the things that I learned from my role in Extinction Rebellion and from watching my young friend storm the world, Greta Thunberg, is that there is a genuine premium in our world today on authenticity, and if we manage to tell the truth authentically, even when it's difficult, and provide those kind of contexts I described for holding that truth, that has incredible power to cut through. And I really believe that we've only just begun to understand and reckon with that power. That's one of the things that gives me profound hope and excitement. And one aspect of that sometimes is to just swear when that seems like the right thing to do. I don't know if anyone's reading Stephen Markley's incredible 1,000-page novel, The Deluge, about our possible climate futures. He imagines a woman in that who is going to try to, and to some extent succeed in transforming American politics, who takes this to another level and just she does a lot of swearing on TV and so on, and it really cuts through. And maybe I've been a bit inspired by her. On spirituality, totally agreed. The civilizational crisis is, among other things, a spiritual crisis. If we get through it, it will be partly because of new and larger spiritual frameworks and traditions. And another thing that really excites me is that they are coming, and to some extent they're already here. A really good book on this is Dark Green Religion by Bron Taylor. Again, an extraordinarily hopeful book because he helps you to understand how the new eco-spirituality that we need, which is also old, is already emerging.
I didn't swear today, but I can promise you every single day, at least once, I will say the fuckery of it all. It just like comes out of my body because I think it's the appropriate response. I just was fundamentally agreeing with you that there is a spiritual reckoning happening. My background has been, over the last kind of near 2 decades, around forms of violence, poverty, class violence, gender and sexual violence, and also around racialized violence. And at the heart of all forms of violence is disconnection. That is what violence is. All forms of violence are disconnection. And so we're being invited to levels of connection that through colonization, capitalism, neoliberalism, just continually is perpetuated. And I think that in order for the times in which we're living in, we're not actually needing to look towards New Age kind of spiritualities or New Age kind of logics around how we move, but it is a Hanikwen elder, indigenous elder from the Brazilian Amazon, had said that the future is ancestral, and what we're actually looking to is the deep remembrance and the deep reparative work towards our traditions, our lineages, our indigeneity, which is everywhere, like all of us have that. And in order to do this work right now, we also have to go straight to source. Like, the rigor of this time requires us to access a level of capacity and training, militancy sometimes, to transition. And the space that we're going to get the restoration, the supply, the sustenance, isn't going to come from our minds. It might not even come from our bodies, but it will come from the land. It will come from source. So an invitation for all of us who are committed to this deep transition is, where are you practicing getting connected to connection to source in order to be able to sustain the level of of rigor that is required for this time, and zeal, and that can be anything. It can be spirit for you, it can be God, it can be whatever it is, but going to that space to access the supply, but also the clarity of vision. For me, it's not about imagination, it's about vision. Like, how are we visioning in this time and accessing and time traveling to be able to move towards the world that is already here but needs to be unveiled? And I think a lot of the visionaries that are around us know that, access that, and tune in, as did Elijah when he tuned into that frequency. I'll hand it.
Thank you. And I think building on that, I think it's very clear, like stuff like our language structures, which are noun orientated, or classification, right? Classification theory was a permission for violence, when we actually, classification theory was at the heart of the racialization that we've seen, and it created the landscape for violence. Objecthood, subjecthood, perspective, these things were tools of power, and they've become so normalized in our worldview that they've created the violence that we talk about in that everyday sense. So it's all this invisible stuff that is actually creating that permission landscape, which I think is really, really important for us to keep remembering. I'm going to quickly go to the panelists to say, we've got a brilliant day coming forward. What would be your hopes for the day, and some hopes that we can all sort of participate in? And maybe one reflection, if you have, of this conversation that we've had in that. But just to sort of briefly.
I'll just say that I would love it if people could see Retrofit, among other things, in the kind of context that I try to lay out, as an emerging, each-way bet on collapse and non-collapse, on something that it makes sense to try to do, whatever the future ends up holding.
What was the second bit, Indy? So I think the thing to keep hold of is I love the start of the day with Imi and, as it's Sarah, and how that ethos that they kind of kicked it off with, which felt very unconferencey. Be nice to keep that going. And I always just sit, when people can sit here and speak as eloquently and beautifully as fellow panelists have done, it always just gives me energy and hope.
Hope for today is that there's a kind of multiplicity of approaches and ideas, all kind of held together by an overarching frame. I think the tendency to think in grand universals responding to some of these crises is very easy, but we have to remember that it was partly that sense of universality which got us into this mess in the first place. And no particular reflections from the panel, except that I feel I've learned a lot and written lots of things to read down, so thank you very much.
Staying with contradiction is an act of expansion, because you're holding more than less. And just really also appreciating the point, Indy, you made a back of Jen around private, the entanglements around private and public, because it's just super present. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Look, can I ask us to, firstly, we're going to, would it be okay if we close this? I think, yeah. So what I'm going to ask us to do, firstly, I want us, the panelists, to thank actually everyone else in the room for being here and listening and being part of this conversation. And I know it's been a bit of lots of information, but I would like to firstly extend our thanks to you and being part of this. Because I think it's really important, right? This is actually genuinely a dialogue, and it will become a dialogue over that day. Second, if you wouldn't mind, if you'd give a thanks to the panelists who've just been extraordinary as well. Thank you.